This building on Llandaff High Street, Cardiff, was once the sweet shop made famous by Roald Dahl in Boy Tales of Childhood. Millions of children are familiar with the horrible Mrs. Pratchett, victim of what Dahl called the Great Mouse Plot. But who was the real Mrs. Pratchett, and how much of this episode was actually true? As more and more comes out about the real nature of Dahl, shouldn't we be looking beyond what he wished us to see? Roald Dahl had a privileged upbringing, son of a wealthy merchant, attending the exclusive cathedral school just round the corner from here. But the origins of the real-life Mrs. Pratchett could not have been more different. Her first recorded name was Catherine Found, Found being a name commonly given to foundlings, babies abandoned by their mothers. We know that she was born in Bridgend about 1855, but whether she was brought up by foster parents or in the local workhouse is uncertain. The fact she could read and write may point to the latter. What we do know is that Catherine came to live here in St Nicholas, a village a few miles to the west of Cardiff. She worked as a servant on a local farm, where she would have enjoyed few, if any, freedoms, and certainly would have come across plenty of rats and mice. I'll come on to the significance of this later. The next thing we know about Catherine, or Kate as she was also known, is that at 20 she got engaged to a shoemaker from Llandaff called Robert Morgan, 10 years older than her. How she met him, we can only guess. Maybe a church day trip to Llandaff? Maybe after walking the 6 miles to Cardiff shops? Maybe at a village fair? Or simply through answering a personal ad? These were quite common in Victorian times. The banns were read out in St Nicholas Church in October 1874, but the marriage didn't take place until the 13th of November 1875. Long engagements were the norm for working-class couples back then, because of the need to save for the cost of the marriage and setting up home afterwards. As was the custom, the wedding took place in the groom's parish church. In Robert's case, this was no less than Llandaff Cathedral. This must have been an awesome experience for Kate, although I can't help wondering how many others were there. Kate's witness signed herself with a cross, so was probably a friend, while Robert's was neither friend nor family but a church official. Robert's mother had died when he was 8, and his father, an agricultural labourer, was in his last months. Maybe this was a factor in Robert's desire to start his own family. The newlyweds moved to Llandaff High Street. Their house doesn't exist anymore, probably because it was not considered fit for human habitation. Kate was unlikely to have been working, and Robert's 23 shillings a week would not have stretched to much more than the rent, the bills, basic food and other household necessities. And soon there were other mouths to feed. Their first daughter, Sarah, followed by another Kate. At last, Catherine had something she could really call her own. But all babies were at risk in damp, cold homes, and tragically, little Kate got a chest infection and died at the age of 7 months. How this affected her mother, we can only imagine, but she was already pregnant again. The next baby was also called Kate. Meanwhile, Robert got himself arrested, just here at the police station which stands guard over Llandaff village. Robert and another man were approaching along this road where the toll house once stood. Robert had a dog and the dog's face was covered in blood. He claimed they'd been hunting, but the police suspected dog fighting. Robert was taken to court, but got off due to lack of evidence. Did the police have it in for him? Or did he have some other reason for wanting to escape Llandaff? Because that is almost certainly what he did. By 1881, he has disappeared from the census record. Kate is registered as still married, but now head of household. 10 years later, she is described as a widow, yet there is no burial record or death certificate for Robert. There are many possible factors at play here. It was customary if a man had left the country for 7 years for him to be considered dead, and it was certainly to a woman's financial advantage to be a widow rather than an abandoned wife. The poor law guardians who distributed welfare did not want to bear the cost of failed marriages. And finally, It was virtually impossible for working class couples to get a divorce, so if things did go badly wrong in the relationship, jumping on a boat at Cardiff Docks may have been Robert's only way out. If that was the case, however, it was a supremely selfish act, abandoning not only Kate but also his young daughters, knowing that this would leave them destitute. If unable to get poor law payments, a woman in dire straits would often depend on the help of friends and neighbours and would be forced to take in lodgers and find some kind of work. Kate was undoubtedly a survivor. She did take in a lodger, another young woman with a child, and to make the extra income she needed, turned to dressmaking. This was an insecure, time-consuming occupation, damaging to both back and eyes, and so poorly paid that a huge number of garment workers turned to prostitution. With young children to look after, Kate presumably did piecework at home, much of it in the evenings and nights. As the weeks and months turned to years, there would have been no relief for Kate. But one piece of new technology would have made a massive difference to her work: the sewing machine. This would have been at least 10 times faster than the painstaking labour of stitching by hand. They were very expensive, but Kate might have been provided one if working for a garment manufacturer. However, it was a mixed blessing, since she would have been required to produce far more garments. Nothing really changed the massively exploitative nature of the rag trade. What we do know is that she had moved by 1891. This was possibly because her house had been demolished. At any rate, she didn't go far, just round the corner here to Chapel Street, to one of these tiny 2-up, 2-down terrace houses. She shared this small space with her now teenage daughters and 3 male lodgers. Presumably the Kate and the girls would have shared one bedroom, while the 3 men slept in the other bedroom. It must have been intensely claustrophobic. And it meant that Kate was not only looking after her daughters and earning a living as a dressmaker, but also cooking, cleaning, and doing the washing for her lodgers. Education was compulsory now, so it's probable that the girls had gone to the national school on the land of High Street. They are marked as scholars on censuses, but they would have left school at 14 at the latest. Incidentally, I don't know the cost of sending Roald Dahl to the cathedral school in the 1920s, but for an 8-year-old today the fees are £4,494 per academic year, and it's not a boarding school. Every Sunday, Chapel Street was a busy place. The Calvinist Methodist Chapel attracted a large congregation to preachers who taught a strict creed of self-denial, particularly of the demon drink, and concerned themselves with social justice and the idea that all were equal in the eyes of God. I think it quite likely that Kate attended this chapel, which may have made her feel some justification for her hard-working and joyous life, and possibly fueled her ambitions for betterment. Again, we know nothing of Kate's interactions with her lodgers, except that she changed lodgers numerous times. There were many reports of landladies having relationships with lodgers, or being suspected of having them. Also of violence between landladies and lodgers. She would have had to have been pretty tough to handle them, and very lucky if she presided over a happy and harmonious household. Clearly, however, she had developed the ambition to improve her situation. By the turn of the century, 2 new shops had been built at the junction of Chapel Street and the High Street, and Kate had a plan for a new, larger home where she could keep 4 lodgers and establish a business. The fact that she'd even considered this must have meant that she had been saving every available penny for years. She would never be considered as a tenant for the new shop without being able to afford a deposit or being able to prove she could reliably pay the rent. Then there would be the cost of fitting out the shop and buying the initial stock. So considering the numerous difficulties of her life, making this move was some achievement. All this happened about 1901. The shop stocked sweets and tobacco, and it was well placed to succeed, directly opposite the National School and round the corner from the Cathedral School, on a street where there were numerous shops but no other confectioners. It was quite likely that Kate and her daughters made some of the stock themselves in the rooms behind the shop. Kate had certainly ensured that girls remained tied to her, not only as children, but for the rest of their lives. When I think of what it was like for this woman, faced with hordes of kids turning out from school, my mind goes back to the sweet shop by the Dahl in Southampton on a match day in the 60s. It was absolute chaos. The children were sticking their hands in the sweet jars, taking out handfuls of sweets, yelling, fighting. It was absolutely impossible for the shopkeeper to keep an eye on them all. If it was half as bad for Kate Morgan, then it would be easy to see why she was not the most cheerful of characters. So was she as horrible as Dahl made out? Well, the shop had been open for over 20 years before he started visiting it. 20 years of stress, long hours, hard work, no partners, and few pleasures. Add to that the stigma she had carried all her life from being born out of wedlock and considered the lowest of the lower, and it wouldn't surprise me if Kate was a bitter, distrustful woman. But dirty? Now let's think about this. He says that she is dirty, but he has put a dead mouse in a jar of sweets. So what's that all about? Let me quote George Orwell. Middle-class people believe that the working class are dirty, and what is worse, they are somehow inherently dirty. This feeling of disgust about the lower classes is what gives the well-to-do their feeling of superiority. Rather ironic, since their houses are generally kept clean by working-class servants. Kate Morgan, however, did not act like a servant, and I believe that was her true crime in Dahl's eyes. Dahl's action, to me, was an act of class contempt. I can already hear the choruses of disapproval. It's just a fun story. It's just like the Christmas panto. And indeed, that's part of the reason for its popularity. Dahl knew how to manipulate people, particularly children. He revelled in this ability, and he achieved this by tapping into comic or fairy tale traditions. But let's be clear, those traditions, when it came to women, were generally misogynistic. Female characters were either angels or hags, Cinderella or the Ugly Sisters, Miss Honey or Mrs. Pratchett. I've already referred to Kate's familiarity with rodents as she was growing up, and the idea that the shopkeeper collapsed on seeing the mouse is highly unlikely. So is the idea that she was cheering on the head as he caned the pupils. And incidentally, as a native South Walian, she would not have spoken like Dick Van Dyke in Mary Poppins. However, I'm sure the caning was real. Theodore Coombs, the head, was by all accounts an autocratic disciplinarian who would have been appalled by what Dahl had done and the effect this might have on the reputation of the school. Now, according to the story, Dahl's mother saw the cane marks and went into the school to give the head a piece of her mind, then sent her son to another school. But there's a problem with this. If his mother was concerned about brutality, why did she later send Dahl to Repton, one of England's most violent private schools, where not just teachers, but older boys had the right to beat the younger ones? I'm sure his mother was mortally embarrassed by the episode, but I do think it's likely that she blamed the school for it. Roald was the little prince who could do no wrong, so it had to be the fault of the boys he was hanging round with, or the fact he was not having a boarding school education. All in all, it had turned into a humiliating episode for young Roald. It was typical of him to turn it into its opposite, a sign of his genius, a glorious achievement. The accepted narrative is that his punishment turned him into a champion of the helpless child against the all-powerful, irrational adult. But this is quite false. His breakthrough story, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, features an all-powerful adult as hero, symbolically murdering a series of children we are invited to dislike. Except Charlie, of course, Dahl's equivalent of what the Victorians called the deserving poor. Dahl plays the same cards as the demagogue, winning people over by creating a common enemy. Children revel in other children coming to sticky ends because it's not them. They are Charlie, or little Roald, giving horrible Mrs. Pratchett her just desserts. Catherine Morgan continued to live above the sweet shop for the rest of her life, finally dying, like her second baby, of a chest infection in 1939. Her 2 daughters remained unmarried and were buried alongside her in simple graves in Lambeth Churchyard, while her old shop is now marked with a blue plaque to the honour of Dahl and has been turned into an Airbnb at £700 a night. This neatly symbolises while Dahl continues to be regarded as a source of light and joy rather than a mean-minded bully and manipulator. His books are at the centre of a multi-million-pound industry which has a vested interest in maintaining his image. But as the saying goes, you can't fool all of the people all of the time.